What is the actual shelf life of granulated sugar, and how can you package it to extend that shelf life? Hi, I'm Kylene and I'm the Provident Prepper. Granulated sugar is an important part of our long-term food supply. It's actually one of our basic staples. And that's kind of funny because in our normal everyday life, our family doesn't actually eat very much granulated sugar. In this video, we are going to talk about the shelf life of sugar and how to best store it and why it's important that you store it in your food storage. Let's start by talking about why white sugar should be a basic staple in your stored foods. The first is because it inhibits microbial growth when it's in large amounts. And large amounts aren't healthy for you, but that's a whole nother conversation. It's great when you are home preserving things like jams and jellies and fruit. It's important in your baked goods, right? Any dessert is going to have some form of sugar in it. And believe it or not, even my taco recipe and my Cuban black beans have a little bit of sugar. Now, I also store honey, right? Because that is one of the things that I prefer to use, but this video is all about sugar. Another reason why sugar is great to have in your long-term food supply is because it'll store indefinitely. If you store it correctly, nothing will happen to it. It needs to be kept away from moisture because it's hygroscopic, which means that it readily absorbs moisture just from the air. So it's got to be packaged in airtight containers, and we'll talk a little bit about that in just a minute. It also should be kept away from heat. But other than that, pretty much sugar that you stored 20 years ago, 30 years ago, will still be good today. And we'll see a little bit of that too. Okay, so we were gifted this sugar from a friend, and we're actually really excited because we love to experiment with old food storage. I found a Best By date on this one of 2015, but as you can see, this is crazy hard. I don't see a Best By date on this one, and it was, there are bugs in there, right? There are all kinds of little critters. The sugar inside the bag, for the most part, looks good. We do have one discolored spot right here, but it's hard, right? Which we would totally expect because it wasn't protected. So the sugar that's inside of here, the coloring looks good. There's another off piece, kind of similar to what was in that one. I'm not sure what that's all about. But for the most part, while the sugar is super hard, it would still be edible if it was dissolved. So is this the ideal way to store sugar? No, obviously the cans, while they could have protected the sugar, they just didn't do a good enough job of protecting it to make sure that it was close enough to its original form. So let's talk about ways that we can store sugar to make sure that it doesn't quite end up like this. But now remember, sugar has an indefinite shelf life, and this sugar is still usable unless it gets contaminated. So we've seen a way that didn't work so well. But let me show you how I do it, and you can decide what would work best for you. So we have what we call a sugar bucket, and this is actually stored on the bottom of my pantry floor. And we store our sugar in buckets or Mylar bags or other containers. And when the sugar bucket gets empty, we take the sugar that we've stored downstairs, we put it inside the sugar bucket, and we use it up. It's our way of rotating. This does have this Gamma Seal lid, which makes it super easy to access. But because I'm always using old sugar, it always means that I have clumpy sugar. It's not nice and new and fresh, but it also means that I have hunger insurance in a pantry that has sugar that has been stored. In the white buckets, it would be best if you lined it with a Mylar bag, because Mylar is not as permeable as plastic, and over time through the walls of the plastic, it will impact your sugar. And the sugar that is in here when we open it, it is in large clumps, and we do have to work to break it up. But another way that you can store it is just by pouring it into recycled PET plastic bottles, bottles that have held juice. We clean them out super well, and we have a video on that, so check the link in the description and it'll walk you through exactly how to store it like this. But you put it inside of these plastic bottles, and you want to make sure that you tape the lid closed in case you didn't have a really good seal on it. But with sugar, you never ever want to add an oxygen absorber. If you put an oxygen absorber in it, it will turn it hard right away. So no oxygen absorbers in sugar. You can also store it in a glass jar. And glass is actually perfect because it's non-permeable. And that sugar inside this glass jar, this is actually flour, it's not sugar. I'm just using it for an example, but it will stay good forever. The glass jars are at risk of breakage, right? So that does complicate things. In the number 10 can, I don't know if you can hear this, but this is sugar, and you can see that it's all loose. I will open this and we'll be able to look at it because it is from 1999. And then Mylar bags is another way to store sugar. Now, we just opened the last of our sugar that was stored in Mylar bags and dumped it in here. And it was clumpy. It was 20-year-old sugar, and well, maybe it was 20, maybe it wasn't quite 20 years old. But it was clumpy, and we're still eating it, we're still using it. But just for full disclosure, how it's gonna turn out. One other thing that you can do is similar to what you saw in the garbage cans, only this will protect it better. You can purchase the sugar in the original bags and just put them inside of a plastic bucket that has a good seal on it, right? Not all plastic buckets have an airtight seal, but you could put it in one with an airtight seal, and you could just tuck it away like that and not take it out of its container or its packaging until you're ready to use it. But let me tell you, if you store your sugar just in a bag like this, it doesn't take very long for the moisture in the air to penetrate this paper packaging and turn your sugar hard. Not turn it bad, but turn it hard. Sugar is also, because it's hygroscopic, it's susceptible to different odors in the air, so you never want to store it by anything that's toxic at all. So for instance, if you stored this next to gasoline, it's going to smell and taste like gasoline. So don't do that. Make sure that you take care of it. I have to tell you one really funny story about the sugar bucket. You know how we keep this in the bottom of our pantry? We have done that and rotated this way for, I don't know, a long time, over 20 years. And when our kids would get in trouble, they would have to go to the pantry for timeout and sit on the sugar bucket until they could sweeten up. And it's funny because I have stories from kids now that they're adults that say, yeah, Mom, we didn't mind that so much because we'd just go in and we'd open the lid and we'd taste the sugar. And quite frankly, as a mom, as long as they sweetened up and were, again, willing to be good members of society, let them do whatever they need. But this was a really fun thing because it's the sugar bucket, you know, time out on the sugar bucket till you sweeten up. Okay, so just for kicks and giggles, we're gonna look and see how some of these fared in food storage. This number 10 can of sugar was packaged in 1999, pre-Y2K. And so it'll be interesting to see. When I shook it, it sounded like it was nice and loose. And when I look at the contents, it's definitely a little bit clumpy. Absolutely a little bit clumpy. But overall, the clumps are coming out super nicely and it doesn't feel like it's hard as a rock. So this feels a lot harder. And when I'm going like this, when I'm trying to break it up, it's definitely possible to break it up, but it feels like it's absorbed a lot more moisture than the can. The can is still real powdery. So overall, the best way to store sugar would be in a metal container or in a glass container because they're non-permeable. You get a very similar result with the bucket as with the Mylar bag. The Mylar bag is probably a little bit better in my opinion. But overall, you just need to store it so that it's away from moisture. Protect it, remember, because it's hygroscopic and it'll absorb moisture. So protect it from the moisture, protect it from the heat, store it in an airtight container, and white granulated sugar should have an indefinite shelf life. I'll leave a link to a post that we've written on food storage, what is the actual shelf life of granulated sugar, but there are links to the information that I'm going to provide to you right now. So the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who is an expert on food storage, recommends that you store about 60 pounds of sugar a year. Brigham Young University did a study and they recommend that you store about 70 pounds of sugar a year. And then TACTA, the American Civil Defense Association, in their TACTA Academy, recommends that you store 65 pounds of sugar per person for a 1 year supply. Now it's kind of interesting because that seems like a huge, overwhelming amount of sugar. But if you take into account that the New Hampshire Department of Health and Human Services says that in 2015, every American was eating an average of 152 pounds of sugar a year. That's actually not that much sugar. The other thing about storing a lot of sugar is that it is a great barter item because in times of shortage, sugar is one of the first things to be rationed. So if you have a little bit of extra sugar, you're just really well off. So considering you need between 60 and 70 pounds, somewhere there-ish, you would want to store 2 5-gallon buckets per person. Or number 10 cans, you would need between 11 and 12. Mylar bags are 7 pounds, so you would need about 10 of these per person for a year's supply of sugar. And like I said, we mix ours up and we store a lot of honey, but I definitely still have sugar in my long-term food supply. And now for the question of the day. What have you found to be the best way to store granulated sugar? Comment below. And thanks for being part of the solution.